The late 19th and early 20th centuries was a time when men were still engaging in occasional lethal duels and to some degree still wielding swords in war. Yet as the craft of swordsmanship in Western civilization transitioned from practical necessity to classroom diversion, contrived duel, and eventual sport, fighting men became effectively disconnected from and largely ignorant of the martial systems from previous centuries. A host of unchallenged misconceptions then arose about earlier arms and armor. Aside from their romantic notions of chivalric knightly combats and the duels of daring swashbucklers, still so influential in popular consciousness, the violent reality of close combat in the medieval and Renaissance eras was altogether different. Earnest fights were not limited to linear back-and-forth affairs, but occurred with 360-degree movement and close contact. Actions were not about a simple slash or poke to merely draw blood, but unregulated lethal blows that would immediately kill or incapacitate. There is no question now that the old orthodox view of personal combat skills from the Middle Ages and Renaissance as something crude or unrefined, a notion forming much of general fencing culture today, has been thoroughly discredited. Yet, part of this recent reassessment is due to the pioneering efforts more than a century ago by a handful of Victorian antiquarians. During the last decade of the 19th century, several British military men, chiefly Captain Alfred Hutton and Egerton Castle, became deeply interested in both the history and the practice of antique forms of extinct swordplay. As the original practitioner researchers of historical fencing, they conducted the first ever important investigations into these forgotten methods and lost teachings. Finding modern fencing authorities and the general public profoundly ignorant of their own martial heritage, they began an effort to explore and reconstruct earlier fighting methods which they recognized as having been long abandoned. It was by forming new fencing clubs and giving presentations and lectures that the group of associates surrounding Hutton and Castle became active. Their main goal was studying with traditional weapons by following and interpreting the earlier methods of the original source literature. But even then they had to struggle to rebuild and recover what little remained from older styles, as they found no medieval and Renaissance teachings still existed within then-current European fencing study or civilian and military dueling customs. There were no authorities or schools to guide them, and a great deal of what they already knew from modern methods was unsuitable. It was for this reason why their work was acclaimed at the time as original and lauded as something groundbreaking. While by the 1880s, Greco-Roman wrestling and boxing had grown in stature as sports, from past centuries only rudimentary folk methods of earnest self-defense were retained to any noticeable degree, such as in catch-as-can wrestling and teachings on basic knife play or stick fighting. Civilian and military fencing traditions had become little more than a mere gentleman's accomplishment, and even a cultured sign of his edification. Judo and jiu-jitsu had even been imported by Europe as something exotic and wholly unfamiliar. Militaries, meanwhile, were now conducting only the barest of lance, saber, and bayonet drills as part of their close combat preparation. But the circle of Hutton and Castle established the fact that little to nothing about Renaissance fighting arts had survived the centuries or been preserved by modern schools and masters of fence. They revealed the depth of the loss, the breadth of ignorance surrounding it, and the work required to recover old swordplay. In many ways, the assumptions and views of gentlemen from their age colored their understanding of Renaissance combatives, thereby limiting their progress. However, they became aware of just how much their peers had failed to recognize or appreciate the complexity and ingenuity of their ancestors' martial expertise. They also learned that the story of fencing could not be isolated from the larger context of military history. They realized that foppish duelists and modern soldiers faced virtually none of the same challenges, nor relied on the same weaponry and military technology as did their Renaissance forebears. It became clear to them that styles of swordplay devised for facing a single opponent one-handed were not more sophisticated than those allowing use of two hands and the full body. It became obvious that gentlemanly methods of fencing under established rules were hardly as complex as open skills devised for all-out fighting with any manner of weapons. Rather than a mere dueling ethos, the Renaissance art of defense reflected a warrior ethic. Its fencing component alone was not about sword fighting, but about fighting with swords. While scholars in several countries were beginning at this time to examine medieval and Renaissance combat more closely, and to trace the history of fencing, only the group of Castle and Hutton in Britain began a program to actively relearn it. Sadly, their efforts were stillborn, as their generation of enthusiasts was to be decimated in the bloody mud-filled trenches of the First World War. Their insights and message was to be forgotten in the new century amid the passing of the formal duel, the popularizing of modern fencing sports, and the entertainment industry's decades of misrepresentation to come. What little remained of their discoveries and insights was to go largely unappreciated until the end of the 20th century. The martial arts of Renaissance Europe is a subject which schools and masters of fencing over the past several centuries abandoned, discarded, forgot, and ignored as they pursued a far more narrow and specialized form of fencing directed largely towards private duels of honor with single identical swords and using gentlemanly methods never envisioned for earlier battlefields and individual combats. This situation, then, is the very reason why historical fencing studies have now come to exist in the first place. It is also why we are experiencing a new renaissance in the exploration of our Western martial heritage through rediscovery of the masters of defense. In many ways, today's enthusiasts of historical European martial arts are the inheritors of the efforts by these private gentlemen devoted to the noble science. Through their attempts to construct a modern curriculum, their legacy is with us in the current resurgence of historical fencing now underway.